Hi class, in this important video we're going to do two things. First we're going to transition from Unit 1 to Unit 2 and talk about why we're doing it and how. But then also I'm going to do a very broad introduction to utilitarianism. I always like to start that way. If we start big picture, it's much easier to aim for and study for understanding. If I know generally what all utilitarian have in common and kind of what the view's about, it makes it much easier to understand the specific readings we're going to do in this unit. So Unit 1, we did several things in addition to introducing ethics generally. We rejected two kind of knee-jerk, very common meta-ethics. So remember, meta-ethics answers the question, what makes an act right or wrong? In egoism and divine command theory, we saw that those wouldn't do the job. But then we didn't try any other candidates. Instead, we dove right into some more specific problems. We looked at the trolley problem. We looked at abortion some. And we didn't resolve a whole lot, but that's okay because we're just starting to get it used to the field of organized structured ethics. Sorry. Well, in Units 2 and 3, we're going to look at some very specific theories of meta-ethics. We're going to look at full, robust, well-defended theories of what makes an action right or wrong. Specifically, we're looking at the three most important, most popular contenders. So in Unit 2 specifically, we're going to look at utilitarianism, which focuses on consequences of actions as determining right and wrong. And so I will introduce utilitarianism in a moment, but again, it's important to realize, we mentioned this in Unit 1, but why focus on theory? Why is theory and meta-ethics so important? Because without theory, it's just a shouting match. We don't have at our disposal moral principles to resolve hard issues like the trolley problem. We are much more frequently prone to bias, to thinking of ourselves as somehow the exception to the rule, or kind of ad hoc changing and modifying our principles of ethics when a situation comes up when we don't want to do that. More generally, we just think asystematically about right and wrong. And so by looking at meta-ethical theories and really closely examining the question, what makes an act right or wrong, is going to make us better people. It's going to make us more systematic thinkers, less biased thinkers, etc. And so we're going to start with a fairly intuitive meta-ethics, utilitarianism. What makes an act right or wrong? What happens? The consequences of the action. It seems like a very reasonable answer. And so that's what we're going to do. So let's say a few things about utilitarianism. First and foremost, I like to think of utilitarianism as the scientists of ethics because, again, they locate right and wrong in consequences, and consequences are observable, predictable, and if you do it right, measurable. Further, it's not always exact, right? We think a consequence, the consequences will be X and maybe they're Y. That happens in the sciences too. If you're a very kind of empirical, science-minded individual, you might like utilitarianism. So what is utilitarianism? Very generally, what all utilitarians have in common, and I want to emphasize what I'm going to be talking about for a while, is what all utilitarians have in common. All utilitarians support what's called the utility principle, or the greatest happiness principle. We'll call it utility principle for the purposes of this course. It says that right and wrong is proportionate to total probable utility. That's my formulation of it, but again, the utility principle says right and wrong is proportionate to total probable utility. First of all, it's important to contrast that with egoism. So an egoist might say something to the effect that right and wrong is what is my utility, or my benefit or my consequences. That's not what the utilitarian says. The utilitarian, by contrast, says that it's determined by total consequences. Everybody's consequences matter. So if an action benefits one person but harms two, that's going to be a problem. And that must be taken into account. But remember, it's not just adding people because it says proportionate to utility. So if an action tremendously benefits one person and very, very mildly negatively affects two other people, the total utility is still positive. Sorry, I don't know why I'm coughing so much all of a sudden. Makes it feel like a lecture in class, right? So, first of all, notice that for the utilitarian, whose happiness we're talking about doesn't matter. Everybody's happiness gets counted. Everybody's happiness gets counted equally, which makes utilitarianism what's called an objectivist theory, that everybody has, in an important sense, the same say. Not that it's voting or anything like that, but everyone matters morally the same. The other thing to notice is that the utility principle is also what's sometimes called an absolutist theory of ethics, because they say that only one thing determines ethics: utility. Notice the utility principle doesn't say anything else except utility matters to ethics, and as we're going to see, that's going to cause some problems. So overall, all utilitarians support the utility principle, that good is proportionate to total probable utility, which means every utilitarian is going to be an objectivist in that everyone's moral standing is in some sense the same. And lastly, they're going to be what's called an absolutist, because only consequences matter to ethics. And just pay attention to those labels, because, again, it's common to anybody who supports the utility principle, which is all utilitarians. But as we're going to see in the Williams reading, those commitments can be problematic. But because they're focusing on total utility, that makes ethics observable, that makes ethics predictable, that makes ethics measurable within reason. So it's what you might call fallibilist, that we have a very, very good idea of what the consequences of our actions are going to be, at least if we try. But once in a while, we still can go wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes people say we don't know the consequences. That can be misinterpreted. That's like saying I don't know the consequences of turning the ignition in my car because my car might not start. Well, I have a very good idea of what's going to happen when I start my car. So as a kind of objection to or worry for utilitarianism, that misses the mark. It would be monstrous to say, I had no idea that punting a toddler was going to harm them. No, you had a very, very, very good idea of what was going to happen with that action, even if it wasn't perfect. So don't say, we don't know. Just say, we can successfully predict, but we're fallible. Again, like some of the hard sciences in that way. We've talked about where all utilitarians agree. Let's talk about some important disagreements in utilitarianism, just very briefly, because we're going to get more into this when we get to the specific readings. So, all utilitarians support the utility principle, but we must talk about how to read that principle and what to apply that principle to. Because notice, the utility principle itself, at least as I've stated it, didn't say anything about action. It didn't say what goods we're trying to maximize, etc. And so there are different interpretations of the utility principle, first and foremost based on what we apply it to. And we're going to start with this distinction. The most common language for it is act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. So every utilitarian is either an act utilitarian or a rule utilitarian. And that decision is a distinction in what we are actually applying the utility principle to. And what are the candidates? Well, they tell you in their names. The act utilitarian says apply the utility principle to the individual act. And that one I think is more straightforward. And so we just act to increase or maximize utility. By contrast, the rule utilitarian points out that, well, what we actually do, or we have these things. So first of all, rule is a technical term, and I'm going to throw a rock at you if you equate rule and law. Those are not the same thing. A rule is a general principle of action. Nothing to do with legality. A rule is a general principle of action. So, what kinds of things are rules? It's general principles that you, the individual, live by or act by. So, a rule might be something like when or if I see someone's life in immediate danger and I can prevent it, I will. That would be something like the rules we're talking about. They should take the form when X, I will Y. So that is a rule. That is a principle of action. The rule utilitarian says, quite simply, that we should follow the rules that increase utility or maximize utility. So what's the difference? The act utilitarian is ultimately going to go on a case-by-case, act-by-act basis. The rule utilitarian instead is going to do their ethics at the library and figure out which rules, when upheld, will generally lead to the greatest total utility. Now, let me say a couple more things about this because I know that's far from clear. Thing one, when we do the SMART reading, this is what Smart's talking about. He just uses different language. He uses extreme and restricted utilitarianism. So that's thing one. Thing two is to realize that even though every utilitarian has to be one or the other, and they're in fact applying the utility principle to two very different things, in practice, they're going to agree 99.9% of the time at least. And so what kinds of situations might they not apply? Well, where the individual action and the general rule might not match. So when it seems like there might be an exception to the rule that is relevant. So let me give a for instance, a couple of for instances, I should say. If a rule and an act utilitarian are walking along and see a child drowning in a river, or sorry, let's say an old person drowning in a river, well, what individual act increases or maximizes utility? Hop in to save the old person in the river. Well, what rule might apply here? Remember, it's the one I just said, that when I see someone's life in immediate danger and I can prevent the issue, I will do so. And so the rule utilitarian, upholding that rule, will also hop into the river to save them. And so, obviously similar considerations are going to apply. Neither of them are going to do random violence, and both are going to say, murder is bad and that kind of stuff. And so they're going to agree the vast, vast, vast majority of the time. What about a situation where they might disagree? Well, you might have, let's go back to the river case. Well, let's change things a little. Let's say that the older gentleman who's drowning in the river is Albert Fish. I don't remember if I've used Albert Fish as an example before, but it's an example that comes up a lot. So briefly, Albert Fish has my vote for worst human being of all time. He was a prolific serial killer, and he specifically targeted children, and he was a sadist, so he would kidnap children, torture, kill, eat, and then sometimes write letters to the kids' parents explaining in painful detail what he did. Just worst human, just terrible. So suppose the person drowning in the river is Albert Fish. Well, What might the act utilitarian do? Well, is it going to increase the utility? Are there going to be beneficial consequences for saving Albert Fish's life? Probably not. So in that case, the act utilitarian might let Albert Fish drown, whereas the rule utilitarian might still have to act under the rule of, well, there's a life that's in immediate danger that I can do something. So that might be a case where they disagree. Or maybe one more, and we'll return to these examples in the SMART lecture, by the way. So say you have a rule, not a law, a rule, that you stop for all stop signs. Well, why is that a rule as well as a law? Because it maximizes utility. Say you're in normal situation, you drive, you stop, you move on, uphold the rule. What's the act utilitarian going to do? Is it going to increase utility to stop at the stop sign? Very likely, and so they will stop as well. New scenario. You have someone bleeding to death in the back seat and you're trying to get to the hospital. Maybe the act utilitarian wants to ignore the stop signs at that point. Maybe the rule utilitarian doesn't. Now, those two examples, when I give those examples, people start to say, well, why would you be a rule utilitarian? That's an excellent question, and there's some very good reasons for them. But I'm not going to give them to you. Well, I'll give you one. Well, suppose the act utilitarian stands on the river, watches Albert Fish drown, wipes the brow and say, wow, good riddance to bad rubbish. And then all of a sudden this person runs up screaming, oh my gosh, what happened to our Albert Fish actor for our documentary? Ooh. Now we have a problem and we might see why the rule utilitarian might have been better in that case. So I'm not going to get into this into more theoretical detail, but notice we do have good reasons now on both sides for action rule utilitarianism, and let those marinate a bit until you get to the SMART reading. So, where are we so far? Every utilitarian has to decide what the utility principle applies to. Does it apply to the individual action? Does it apply to rules? Not laws, rules. And then we follow the rules. So notice those lead to two different kind of moral injunctions of what ethics tells us to do. An act utilitarian is going to say, act so as to increase or maximize utility. The rule utilitarian then is going to say something a little different. They're going to say, act so as to uphold the rule that when followed would maximize or increase utility. So the slightly different demands for action based on if you're an act or rule utilitarian. Again, they're going to agree 99% of the time. But when they disagree is important. We'll have a reading on that. That's the SMART reading. Second thing that utilitarians have to pick one or the other is, are all goods comparable or not? So notice I've already talked quite a bit about measuring and observing and comparing and totaling goods. Is that a reasonable enterprise? Well, we will see. So what are the two divisions here? Are traditionally called hedonic and idealist utilitarianism. So hedonic utilitarianism says that all goods are comparable. That doesn't say all goods are the same, but that all goods are on the same scale. So hedonic utilitarian, all goods are on the same scale. So for instance, is this highlighter as good as a Lamborghini Diablo? No, but perhaps 400,000 of them are. And if you're like, well, that's weird, just run it through a nice conversion medium called money, if you'd like. You can see if you put them both in terms of dollars and cents, it's easy to see how a dollar highlighter is comparable to a $300,000 car. Very similarly, we're going to have to create a unit of measure for utility, for happiness. And that's one of the things that the Bentham reading is going to help us on. And I'll say more about that. I'll say more about that now. But the Bentham reading is really kind of helping us put our utilitarian hats on to say, well, how do we go about thinking of all probable utility? We're going to have to measure it somehow, as just mentioned, but we also have to think through who all is affected by these actions. And so the best way to read the Bentham, which will be the first reading of the unit, is to really just think in terms of what does the utilitarian have to pay attention to? All probable consequences. That's a big task, and it's also very, very open to bias. Because we very often think only about my consequences or my family's consequences or the immediate consequences or the short-term consequences. Those are all just cheats, by the way, because if you only focus on the consequences you want to, you can always get the answer you want instead of the right answer. And so you should think of the Bentham reading as saying, well, how do we go about thinking of all probable consequences? So let me just give one quick example of the difference. Well, what's safer, your average SUV or your average sedan? Well, most people knee-jerk reaction is to say the SUV. But notice that's not the safer vehicle. That's the safer for me and my family vehicle. SUVs are actually much less safe for the whole. They're much more likely to cause fatalities and accidents. And there have been some really good studies about how much visibility they block. The very fact that you can't see what's in front of the car in front of you leads to a lot more accidents. And so the visibility blocking of SUVs also makes them less safe. And so there's a good difference. Well, when somebody asks me what's the safer vehicle, we tend to think safer for me. But Bentham is trying to remind us that we have to think through all of this stuff, and when you do that, you're probably going to get a different answer. But to do that, to bring us back to hedonic utilitarianism, we have to think about all these consequences and sum them and add them up and compare them. And that requires that goods be comparable, that we could somehow put all of this stuff on the same scale. So again, hedonic utilitarian says all goods go on the same scale. Not all goods are the same. All goods go on the same scale. By contrast, the idealist utilitarian says not all goods go on the same scale. So first of all, there's a very big difference between not all and none. Once more, it's important to realize these two branches of utilitarianism are going to agree 99.9% of the time. Is the idealist utilitarian going to say that the marker is comparable to the Lamborghini? Of course. That's not the kind of things that are incomparable. What kind of things might be incomparably good? Comparing justice and BLTs. There just does not seem to be a conversion there, says the idealist utilitarian. And so that's the other big difference. And so every utilitarian must say, what do we apply the utility principle to it? To the individual act or to the general rule of action? That determines act or rule, but also every utilitarian is going to say, and when we talk about utility, do all goods go on the same scale, or are there some goods that don't go on the same scale? And that is hedonic versus idealist. And since every utilitarian must make a decision on both of these matters, that means we can have different combinations. So for the reading's sake, let's just talk about our two major utilitarians, Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Jeremy Bentham, we already mentioned, is a hedonic utilitarian. He thinks that all goods go on the same scale. He's also an act utilitarian. So Bentham is a hedonic act utilitarian. Big picture, that means he's just going to say, act so as to maximize utility. By contrast, John Stuart Mill is a rule utilitarian, and he's also an idealist utilitarian. He thinks that not all goods are comparable. And so, how is Mill going to tell you to act, roughly speaking? And we're going to have to unpack this when we get to the Mill. He's going to say, act so as to uphold the rule that increases or maximizes the utility generally in such a way that you do not trade a higher good for a lower good. We're going to work on that a little, but notice those two figures are going to agree 99% of the time, but the devil's in the details, and so we're going to be looking at that. And so that's where we're going. Then we're going to look at some objections and applications. I know that was a lot, which is why I like to have an introductory video before we even crack a book here. But if you want to start thinking on the discussion board, your initial reactions, do act or rule utilitarianism seem better? Does idealist or hedonic utilitarianism seem better? And by the way, those are all required terminology for the unit. And we will see you next time.